Good afternoon, and welcome to our first online Endowed Chair interview. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. I am Emily Rankin, Assistant Vice Chancellor of Development. Today's interview is sponsored by UC Riverside's Chancellor's Associates Program, which recognizes donors who make a $2,000 gift or more to UCR each year. Each year, members of Chancellor's Associates are treated to inside glances into UCR's innovative research and programs and are included in specialized communications from the Chancellor, which provide campus updates and membership highlights. To all those members of the Chancellor's Associates joining us this afternoon, thank you for all you do to support UCR. Our first interview is with Professor of Psychology Aaron Seitz, who is the Endowed Term Chair for Research Excellence and Undergraduate Research Mentoring in the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. For anyone who is not familiar with Endowed Chairs, they are established with donor gifts to an academic area. The Endowed Chair created from that gift provides ongoing financial support to the faculty member who holds the chair beyond salary in perpetuity. The professor is free to use that support for research, teaching, or service activities. For the university, an endowed chair allows us to honor and recognize superior faculty. An endowed chair gives these faculty the autonomy and the prestige to develop good ideas and to act on them quickly and in a concrete way. A few housekeeping items for this event. You as the audience can see us, but we cannot see you and you cannot see each other. If you have questions, please submit them for the Q&A by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be answered as time permits at the end of the interview. Our interviewer for today is Iqbal Pitawala, who is a Senior Public Information Officer in the University Communications Office at UC Riverside. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce Ms. Allison Campbell. Allison Campbell is a Heritage Outreach Manager at the Washington State Historical Society, where she coordinates programs and services to support local history museums and historical societies across the state. She earned her MA in Museum Studies from New York University and began her career at the Tenement Museum in New York City before moving on to the Ellis Island Immigration Museum, Museum of Riverside, Museum of Life and Science in North Carolina, and the Fort Nisqually Living History Museum in Tacoma. She has developed award-winning public programming aimed at engaging new audiences, including the escape room, Trapped, Escape Fort Nisqually. Allison and her mother, Rochelle Campbell, have established a variety of funds impacting UCR across the entire campus. Those include the Neil A. Campbell Science Library Learning Laboratory, the Campbell-Wessler Endowed Undergraduate Research Award, the Campbell Family Early Childhood Education Endowed Fund, and the Endowed Term Chair for Research Excellence and Undergraduate Research Mentoring held by Dr. Seitz. It is my pleasure to introduce Allison.
Thank you, Emily. And it's my pleasure to introduce Aaron Seitz today, Professor of Psychology. He is the director of the UC Riverside Brain Game Center for Mental Fitness and Wellbeing and director of the UCR Aging Initiative. His research with over 100 peer-reviewed publications has led to new insights regarding mechanisms of perception, learning, and memory, and how to translate this knowledge towards the development of applications designed to better measure and train cognitive processes. Seitz founded the UC Riverside Brain Game Center and Mental Fitness and Wellbeing to apply this knowledge with the goal of creating a new class of digital cognitive diagnostic and intervention programs that can be effective in improving performance in real-world activities. He has numerous grants from the National Institutes of Health and National Science Foundation targeted to addressing needs of those with mental health challenges, brain damage, neurodegeneration, as well as to use these methods to enhance mental fitness and well-being in education and the workplace. Further, as the director of the UCR Aging Initiative, he leads a campus-wide effort to promote healthy aging and to address the needs of our growing aging population. His research spans numerous departments and colleges where he has joint appointments in computer science, bioengineering, biomedical sciences, and psychiatry. And he works closely with folks in art, music, creative writing, School of Management, and the Graduate School of Education, as well to create numerous training opportunities for students across the UCR campus. So thank you all for joining us today, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Seitz.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here today and a great honor to be the recipient of the Campbell Chair.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the interview with Professor Seitz. My name is Iqbal Pinilwala. I am going to be asking Aaron a few questions. So, Aaron, how long have you been at UCR?
So now about 12 years. And so actually, yeah, I came, right before the previous kind of financial crisis, and here spanning for the current one. So it's been an interesting ride.
So, in addition to being named the Endowed Term Chair for Research Excellence and Undergraduate Research Mentoring, you are the director of the UCR Brain Game Center. What has been your professional journey like in getting to this position, and how has it shaped your approach to work?
Yeah, so my background's actually kind of as an undergraduate math major. And what my path really has been is kind of trying to find kind of where are the areas where I thought I could have kind of an impact on the world that I'd be able to see. And so I started off with kind of mathematics that really helped shape my thinking. I started gravitating towards psychology and neuroscience, where I really was interested in kind of how the brain worked. And I did a lot of different research. So a lot of it was kind of very basic science, understanding mechanisms of learning in the brain. And kind of as my career developed, I really was interested in how can I take this knowledge and translate it to something that could actually help people. And so that got me going, starting the UCR Brain Game Center, where really what we're trying to do is kind of be a translational lab where we take, knowledge in the field and try to apply it to human betterment. And then also the work with the aging initiative at UCR, which is similar, where, it's really trying to figure out kind of how we could take knowledges from the sciences and, translate that to something that's going to be helpful to people.
So you've called it the Brain Game Center, but it's not the kind of center that anyone can kind of walk in and play games to sort of like take your brain to the gym. It's not that kind of a center, is it?
No, well, it sort of is. I mean, in that, it's kind of an interesting center. I wish I'd be able to show people, and maybe at some point I will again, but there's kind of two halves of it. So the back half is really a little bit of a software company. So we're just about to hire our 4th full-time programmer. And so we're developing software that is set up to be able to measure cognitive function and training programs, some of them games, some of them not games, to try to elevate it. And then the front of the center is kind of a human laboratory. And so we have students come in and play our games. We've had older adults, we've had kids with ADHD and with ASD, and so we do some of the studies on site. But yeah, it's not like you just kind of walk in from the street. Usually you're invited to be a steady participant.
Great. And what does this endowed chair mean to you, and how does it benefit your center?
So it really solves a fundamental problem that I've had for a while, in that, a lot of what I do as a university professor is to mentor students. And that one of the things that I've discovered as I've been more and more successful getting extramural grants is that I have a lot of money to do specific projects. So, basically a grant is I, write a proposal to the National Institute of Health. They fund a specific project, like one, that I have right now of training people in working memory. But there's not a lot of flexibility in terms of that beyond what's proposed. And so the role that I have as a faculty member to mentor students with their own ideas, that's something which I've actually found that it's much harder to fund. So there's many cases where I've tried to fund an undergraduate student, have been told that essentially the type of money I have is the wrong color. And so I can't support a student with a fellowship. And so instead I could hire them for a job. And so what the chair really does is allows me to fund students to be able to come up with the next generation of ideas that will hopefully turn into, grants that allow us to do a lot more. but being able to support students to really work on something without specific timelines and schedule and goals, and instead be, creative, is something which this is really transformative for.
That was actually my next question. What does the support that this endowed chair gives you, what does it allow you to accomplish that you might not be able to accomplish otherwise?
Yeah, and the key thing is supporting the next idea, and doing it in a way that I think has a lot more flexibility and freedom, and this is something which it kind of surprised me, when I came to the university, realizing that in some cases there's monies that technically I have, they just can't be spent, as fellowships. And one of the things which is really exciting about my lab is I'll typically have maybe 50 or 60 undergraduates working in the lab per quarter, and that a lot of them will work in the lab for sometimes 2 or 3 years. And so at the very beginning, they're just trying to learn how to do research and gaining skills. But as they spend more time, that's the place where being able to give them some financial support to be able to do a creative project, especially projects that will span different departments and colleges, because we have some students from art and music, others from psychology and business and neuroscience, and it's really kind of a unique situation where we can get students from different disciplines working together, and the bonus of them being able to work together on a new idea just heightens the center.
So for people in the audience who may not be familiar with your research, would you please describe some of your research interests?
Yes, so the way this center started is that I have kind of a long-term background in a field called perceptual learning. And so what this field is focused on is understanding essentially the brain processes related to the perceptual system changing across time. And so if you look at the classic studies in the field, what these studies are is that you would show somebody, let's say, a vertical line, and then you see what is the smallest deviation from vertical they could tell. And then you train them on this to be able to refine that ability. And, or same thing with motion directions, or sometimes you'll find it with seeing a shape that's in camouflage. And so there's this whole research line that I grew up with, which is really focused on kind of when do you learn, where in the brain is this learning occurring, and also kind of when the learning is specific to what you trained on versus transferring to something else. So for instance, the job talk I gave at UCR was a study where I actually food and water deprived human subjects, and I had them stare at a computer monitor with a tube in their mouth. And every so often a drop of water would come through the tube, and this is a reward because they're thirsty. And that I would show different stimuli to each eye. So to one eye, I would show kind of these subtle oriented patterns. And the other eye, I'd show these bright flashing colored mandarins. And what this did was it made it so that people never perceived those oriented patterns that they were exposed to, but they were paired with these drops of water. And so what I was able to establish was that if I tested them after this, they were better able to discriminate the stimuli that were paired with the water droplets, even though they never saw them. So from the basic research perspective, this gave an idea that reinforcement is really important for learning in the system. And on the other hand, this learning was only seen when you show the stimulus to the trained eye. So if you show the oriented stimulus to the untrained eye, you should no learning effect. And so this kind of shows the root of the current kind of brain training field, is that we understand these mechanisms like reward improving learning. At the same time, what we see is that depending upon how you train, in this case, you'll get learning that's very specific to what's being trained. And so in the Brain Game Center, what we've been trying to do is kind of take this knowledge and try to figure out, okay, well, if we know that let's say the adult visual system can be trained in this way, how would you train it in such a way that you get it to generalize to something else? And so when I came to UCR, one of the things we did was we created a training program that kind of took these principles, but also trained people on more things. So basically not just, one orientation, one eye, but stimuli of different orientations, different places on the screen. And we used things that we've learned from the basic research, like how you reward and direct attention and use multisensory stimuli. And so we trained the baseball team with this, thinking that, okay, if we train them in the right way, well, they should be able to maybe see better on eye charts, but maybe they'll be able to hit baseballs better. And so what we found was exactly that, is that, we trained the baseball team for a couple months in the off season, and that we found that after training, they could, see better on eye charts, but they also had fewer strikeouts, more runs created. We could use sabermetrics to show they won more games. And this kind of really shows kind of what we're trying to do generally in Brain Game Center, is that, take this basic knowledge and say, can we apply this in such a way where it could train people so that they'll be able to perform better in their activities of choice? And once we did this with vision, we've now been expanding with hearing and memory and executive function. And then also, as we do this, there's a big question: how do we measure whether somebody got better or not? And we've developed a lot of tools to be able to measure hearing and vision and memory and executive function. And that some of these have actually a lot more applicability, than the training, in that they could help us with diagnoses of people with hearing loss and vision loss or memory conditions, et cetera, and so on.
So it sounds to me like many of the studies being run at the Brain Game Center rely on the participation of a lot of volunteers. Do you have a project currently going on that seeks volunteers that you might want people to know about?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're currently running a nationwide study that's funded by the National Institute of Mental Health to get 30,000 people to train on working memory. And so this is a study that is really trying to kind of change a long-term debate in the field, in that there's lots of studies that people have found evidence that memory can be trained in these particular ways. And there's lots of people who then do other studies showing that, well, it doesn't always work. And the take that we have, which does require a lot of people, is the observation that maybe not everybody needs the same medicine. And so what we're trying to do with this study is that we have a bunch of questionnaires and tests that we use to try to understand individual differences. And then we have a bunch of different training types. So if you sign up for the study, what will happen is that we will be randomly assigned to a certain training condition. And we don't actually have a belief that any of these training conditions are better than any of the others. But we do believe that some of them will be better for certain people and others for other people. And that's what we're trying to establish to change the conversation, is that if we could understand people's individualized needs and give them the type of training program that might be best for them, then we could move forward to having really more kind of personalized training approaches. And so I wonder whether we could share kind of a link to the study in the chat. But this is something where, we're really right now trying to ramp up, and it's hard to get, 30,000 people to participate in a research study, but this is one that has a lot of merit.
Great. What makes the research being done at the Brain Game Center important to do at this time?
There's a lot of pieces, and I think that, so one dimension, I think, is the transition from kind of population health to personalized medicine. And what we're doing is really trying to create a generation and start looking at our testing programs that understand kind of what I've been calling individual profiles of cognition. So like a great example is that one of the things that is actually one of the most exciting projects we have is a grant to develop a new set of hearing tests. And the observation here is that about half of people who self-report hearing problems, like, you go to, I guess nowadays we don't go to bars or restaurants, but when we used to, how well you could hear the people who were around you in a noisy environment. And then they would go to an audiologist. You do the standard test where you hear these quiet tones and you raise your hand. And that about half of people who have hearing problems do perfectly fine on that test. Sometimes, you might be tested with the audiologist where they'll play speech and noise. Those speech and noise tests also have an extremely poor correlation with self-report. And so what we've been developing is a kind of battery of tests that used to only be able to exist in kind of specialized, labs of auditory psychologists and neuroscientists. But we've been able to translate them so they run on phones and tablets and other computers. And what they try to do is measure a bunch of different aspects of hearing. So what we call central auditory processes. So the aspect of hearing that seems to be subserved by the brain rather than by the ear. And that we're measuring multiple dimensions of these. And that by doing this, we're hoping that we could understand not just the half of people who are kind of ignored by the standard tests, but with everybody, what is your personal profile of hearing? And then based upon that, well, what is the personalized intervention that is going to help you with your hearing needs? And for some, it might be a hearing aid. For others, it might be a training program. For others, it might be medications. But, this individualized understanding is something that really is going to be the next big set of breakthroughs in terms of, cognition. And we're trying to do the same thing, not just with hearing, but also with vision and with memory.
Great. What would you say are maybe the top 2 or 3 important discoveries your center has made?
So in terms of discoveries, so to some extent, I might change the question a little bit and go for the ones that we're making. And the reason I'm doing that is kind of as I've spent more time with science, especially kind of the field I'm in, that the key things is that it's a continual process, and that it's rarely the case that we, like with this baseball study, it's not really a discovery per se that I'm able to kind of find a difference between a training that will give rise to something that transfers to baseball versus the training that gives rise to something that only works in one eye. What really it is a kind of a paradigm shift where what we've learned kind of with the research is, I think, a few things. One is that there are huge individual differences that are completely unappreciated in the field. So that, the typical way of doing research, especially intervention research, is you grab a group of people, you give half, let's say some placebo treatment and another half some active treatment. You average whatever outcomes across those people, and you make a determination this thing works or not. And that, what we've seen again and again is that 2 people with the same intervention will have completely different trajectories. And that the thing which is frustrating is we don't always know why yet. But really focusing on this observation is something that, I think will allow us to make progress where other people have failed, in that how do we understand, how these people are different? And then if we want them both to obtain a similar outcome, what are the different types of interventions that each of them are going to need to be able to achieve that. And that, our hope is over, the next few years, especially with these large scale studies, that we'll be able to understand this better and better. The difficulty though is like, it's more of a career than a study, because, it's with each, answer, you have 10 more questions. And, what I found is that, research isn't simple. You basically have to try a bunch of different things. And, for instance, with some of these brain training approaches that, are very popular, because especially in terms of all of us as we get older, that, we're concerned about our vision and our hearing and our memory. And, one of the things that I've learned is that it's as important to discover that something doesn't work than to determine which ones do. Because right now you have all these people who are pursuing paths that might not be the right one. And that as a researcher, you need to be a little bit humble in that, your most exciting idea, failure is, equally informative as success sometimes.
Thank you. So part of the purpose in creating this endowed chair is to support faculty who weave education and research into high quality teaching. So Aaron, how do you practice that?
So the thing that has been the most exciting that we've done over the last few years is really kind of build up the apprenticeship model of teaching. So, I do teach, large lecture courses and graduate seminars, but the things that I really find exciting is being able to have a lab where I could bring in, as I said, like 50 or 60 undergrads, and then have them get a research experience that then can be blended with, discussing papers and conversations about, the broader impacts of what we're doing. And also, as I've been saying before, having students from multiple disciplines contributing kind of the unique strengths to the projects, that then kind of the lines between, research and teaching really blur. But what they get out of this is a deeper experience, and then also skills that are really important to open up, career possibilities. And so I've been, finding kind of more and more ways to spend, time in the center to be able to develop these projects, and, nowadays we require all the students in the lab to develop posters, and that some of those posters are just presented within the lab. A lot of them are presented at undergraduate research symposia. But, it's really making it so that, what actually the university doesn't kind of always look at as teaching the same way, is, giving them everything they could get and more from a classroom experience.
Would you talk a little bit about your experiences with mentoring students?
So, yes. And so, as I said, I work with a lot of different students across different disciplines. And so what I try to do really is to kind of go through a process where I try to figure out, what are the goals of each student? And then when I look at the undergrads, I'll often try to pair them up with each other for projects. With graduate students, oftentimes, the goal is to basically train people to be independent researchers. But that what I have the opportunity to do is that, I could have students working in a lot of different directions. So for instance, I have some projects that are focused on machine learning. I have some projects that are focused on brain imaging and electrophysiology. I have some projects that are focused on developing software. I have some projects where I've had students create narratives for the game. So I worked with a couple of creative writing students, and they're, the goal was to basically create a story that would make players want to continue with the game because they want to know what's going to happen next. And that, with each one, what we need to discover is kind of what is the pedagogy that's appropriate for their discipline, so that the work is going to be something that is going to count towards whatever they need for graduation requirements, or if it's a PhD for their thesis. At the same time as something that will fit in with this broader whole that we have of, how do we understand, measure and train brain function.
Thank you. In your mind, what value do endowed chairs bring to universities?
So I think multiple aspects of value. So one that I've already said is that it provides me with the resources to do the types of projects that otherwise I couldn't do. Because, as I said, the center is one that is well funded from some perspectives, but my hands are tied with how it's being spent because it's a contract with the government. And that having some funds that we could use for the next creative idea or to fund a student who has a particular need, is something that, there aren't a lot of paths towards. And so the other thing I think which is important is that, for faculty, there's this kind of constant search for recognition in that, as one goes through one's career, one is being kind of constantly evaluated with grants and papers and things of that sort. And that it's actually very important to have, awards that show that there is kind of recognition of faculty members that will then, help with when they're trying to get their papers published or when they're speaking at conferences so that people will pay a little bit more attention. And that, it's also, personally nice to get, recognition because, it's, is a huge amount of work being a professor at university between, the research, the teaching, and the service. And it does feel good to, be given an honor like this.
And my final question to you before we take some questions from the audience is, what are your future plans for research moving into being an endowed chair? Yes,
and what I really want to do is kind of expand this blended kind of research teaching model. And so one of the things that I'm excited to do, and I'm still in the process of kind of figuring out kind of what the best structure is basically, have kind of a year-long structure for students where they can, apply to get, a piece of this fellowship money by making a proposal. And then what I want to do is basically set up, ideally students from different disciplines so they work together as a team on a project and that have the time to be able to kind of take some risks and kind of develop ideas that they might not otherwise have the chance to have, and even as a center that we might not do otherwise. Because, as I said, like a lot of the money is set up where we have to get something right. What's really nice about these types of student projects is try something out that might be a completely different idea than I might have ever had and see where it goes. Learn from that and then, go to the next project. And so, it's going to be actually some work on my part to figure out how to get this model to work well. But I'm really excited to, kind of tell students at the beginning that, this is not a job, it's a fellowship. And that a fellowship, your goals are to explore this area and, at the end, be able to present something about, your successes and failures.
Great, thank you very much, Aaron. Those are my questions. I'm gonna see if we have some questions from the audience. It looks like we do have a few. One is, what is the future for developing and using brain games as a treatment for cognitive dysfunction?
That's a great question. And so I think the key thing to recognize is that, currently there are not clear accepted treatments for cognitive dysfunction. And that the place where brain games I think can be very helpful is that kind of what brain games typically are like focused exercises. So like what I often give an analogy for is, when you go to the gym and you might do an exercise that is going to be just focused on your biceps, or is just going to be focused on, your back, or, different muscle groups. And that, whether you're doing this, like with the athletes, because you want to be able to be stronger, more endurance, or if you're doing it for physical therapy, because you're trying to kind of revitalize these muscle groups and build new strength. That it's known when you're talking about muscles that you need very targeted exercises in combination with, maybe lifestyle activities. When you get to issues like cognitive dysfunction, people really don't know as much. I mean, that, a lot of the recommendations are, learn new things, do some complex tasks, be social. And all these are good recommendations, but what they don't fill in is this gap of how do you basically exercise that specific muscle to the right amount. And so what the brain games essentially are, repetitive exercises similar to what you might have in physical therapy that are really trying to target individual cognitive muscles. And that I think the future is understanding which are the right exercises to give, to whom and when, in combination with what other activities. Because I don't think that the idea is, oh, just do my brain games and that's going to solve all your problems. But I think that it fills an unmet niche that can be, I think if done right, really profoundly important to many people.
All right. We have a question from someone who writes, I participated in your brain game study for those who are 55 and over. Would you please explain the purpose of the game, what each section was testing, and will we get individual feedback from our participation?
So my guess is that this was a recent study that we did where we're comparing a gamified version of a working memory task to a non-gamified version of it. And that this is the exact type of task where we actually expect that different individuals will gain the most benefit from the different task types. And so what we found when we did the study was about half the participants said they preferred the game and half the participants said they didn't like the game as much. The people who didn't like the game as much, a lot of them, it was because there's like too much distraction. And that, one of the theories that we have, and actually just earlier this week, we got a very encouraging score from on an NIH grant that hopefully, if things go well, will fund this research at a larger scale, is trying to predict, based upon performance and cognitive tests, which people will get the most benefit from non-gamified tasks and which people would get the most benefit from the gamified task. And so our preliminary data is pretty encouraging in that it looks like these hypothesized differences exist. And also, as I said, it looks like it may have been sufficient to be able to grant some government funding to be able to do the grant at a larger scale. But the core is what I've been saying all along is how do we understand individualized needs and give people the intervention that would be best for them. As far as giving people personalized results, that's something which is always a little complicated because the way we do our science is that everybody is assigned to a anonymized participant number. And what this means is that all of our data analyses are without knowing who the data is from. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is build into the programs methods that we could generate reports to people so they could kind of understand what their performance is. But it's something which we have to do very cautiously because, for instance, when we test people in a research study, what we don't want to do is give people the impression that even necessarily a high score is better than a low score. So actually a great example of this is there's a new project that we have funded that's by the EF Plus Math Foundation. And so this is a foundation which is focused on trying to undo systemic racist outcomes in math education, focusing on Black and Hispanic populations. And so the observation here is that, so EF stands for executive functions. And so what's been historically the case is that you have kids where you test, whether it's an intelligence test or a memory test, and they basically get a score. And this score has often been used to divide classrooms. Here are your high performers, we'll give them great challenges. Here are the low performers, they go to shop. Or that, they're told that their math proficiencies aren't as good or things of that sort. And the core concept in this study is to go back to this cognitive profile where essentially everybody has a different distribution of, memory performance, attention performance, ability to inhibit distractors, and that these really, it's not that some profiles are necessarily better than others, as much as some profiles might be informative to different ways of learning than others. And that, the core idea of all that we're doing is basically trying to help people understand, what these skills are and what it might mean to them in terms of, whether what sort of training they might want to do or how they might want to, in this case, approach math problems. But the big challenge, and this is something that we're trying to figure out, is communication. How do we find a way to present the data in such a way it's going to be meaningful to the participant, as opposed to just going into comparisons, which we find often not particularly useful.
Great, thank you. We have someone who's asking, how many graduate students do you support, and how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted research productivity and the ability to financially support student research?
So I currently support 6 graduate students, and that in terms of COVID-19 on the research, the effects have been, I'd say, profoundly bad in that, all of them had research projects that relied upon running human subjects in person. And so we had some people where they're using the Center for Advanced Neuroimaging, where that's currently shut down. We had, one student who basically, she's in her last year of research, and she was one of the people who was leading this study in older adults that we just spoke about. And that, right now that study, it's probably, put off by a year before we'll be able to necessarily collect a lot more data. And so that in terms of what the students' plans were, they've been put off in a way that, has been, very difficult. On the other hand, the positive is that the way research works is that there's always another approach. So for instance, some of the students are going to do additional data analyses of data they already have. Other students are going to try to see what sort of projects they can do where they're run remotely. So for instance, in our lab, we're doing a lot of studies now where we have people who will basically do the session via Zoom. So that basically via Zoom, we'll instruct them how to download the software and how to run through the exercises. And so that's going to work for some of them. But, I think the negative is that, all the previous plans are broken. The positive, I guess, is that I think they're learning important life skills in terms of, how to adjust to difficult situations. Financially, we're in better shape in that, a lot of the funding actually comes from TA-ships. So basically, helping teaching support in classes through psychology. And so those classes are still going on. In fact, actually, we had higher summer enrollments. And so more TA-ship opportunities than we had last summer. And then research funding, actually we've been doing fairly well grant-wise for the short term. But I think the places where funding is probably the biggest challenge is for the students who need additional year of funding. And that's the place where I have a bunch of international students. And so for international students, both we need to find ways to extend the visas, which we're doing, but also finding money to be able to support extra time that's needed. And, for the domestic students, they're a little bit better off, but still there is going to be the issue of, if they need extra time, are there going to be enough TA-ships? Are there going to be enough, research assistantships? And, I think across the university, there's a fair amount of anxiety about that right now.
With regard to study outcomes, do you notice an advantage for younger students who have, played video games versus, say, seniors who weren't gamers?
The funny thing is that the advantage is actually kind of the opposite, and that it's typically the case that you find the seniors who will get greater benefits from the training. And that there's also some studies that show that, playing certain types of video games, can have positive effects for certain aspects of attention and working memory. And so in some cases, it depends on the video game, but some of the video games will have similar properties to our training, and that our training might not be as helpful to them. And I think the other thing to think about is that if you start looking at cognitive skills, ranging from, basic perception to memory, attention, executive function, essentially, if you start looking at graphs of these as a function of age, it all kind of goes up to about 24. So 24 is your peak. And then after 24, what we find is that there's declines in about everything other than crystallized intelligence. So vocabulary goes up with age. Knowledge of other types goes up with age. Actually, sometimes creativity. Actually, Wei Sheng, who's a professor in psychology, found some evidence that with older adults that creativity went up a little bit. So, there's some kind of balancing. But when you start looking at individual trajectories of people across the lifespan, what you find is that there's a huge variance. So that, once again, when you average people and you say, okay, what is the average memory capacity of somebody who's in their 70s? It's much lower than the 24-year-old. If you look at individuals, you find some who do better than the average 24-year-old and some that do worse. And so you basically get this big spread. And so that big spread actually is the opportunity, because for the people who have not shown much decline since when they were younger, they might not get a lot of benefit from this training program. For the people who have shown declines, then these types of trainings have, are one of a number of things that have potential to be able to kind of move you up again. And so that I think, the promise is actually better for older adults than younger adults.
Thank you. Somebody wants to know, do you use brain games yourself, and do you encourage family members to play them?
So in terms of myself, I've spent a lot of time testing the games out. So, since we developed them, I've spent countless hours testing them to make sure that, the software doesn't crash, that it's, showing the stimuli the right way, the messages, et cetera, and so on. And that I've definitely noticed some differences both in my vision and memory as I've done this. And then, like, I noticed my dad is actually one of the attendees. I recently involved him in one of our studies. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that I will say that, even doing this on myself, there are certain of our programs that I think work for me. And there's others that I don't think do as much for me. That's kind of one of the reasons why, like, when I start looking at the same program that doesn't seem to do as much for me, but seems to be doing something for someone else, that's where I've been trying to understand, okay, what predicts that difference?
All right. Maybe we'll take one more. Are any baseball teams currently using your brain game training?
So, yes. What's interesting is that, so the vision training that I created, so I had a UCR startup company that kind of made the software. So the company was called Carrot Neurotechnologies, and the program is called Ultimize. And when we started selling this, it was being sold for about $6 a download. And sometimes when it was on sale, it was always $1 download. And so there's about a dozen major league teams that flown me out and interviewed me, and I did some studies with some of them. But then what I started discovering was that lots of people were starting to use it without any coordination with us. For instance, I gave a talk at Oxford, and I went to dinner with the graduate students and postdocs, and I was talking with the postdocs, and he's like, yeah, my brother's in a minor league team. And they've been using this vision training program. They say, like, it helps them see better at night games, and it's great. I was like, yeah, what is it? And so he texted his brother and found out it's my program. The thing which, was kind of a little complicated is that, like, I would love to have coordination and be able to kind of get the data from these teams and such as that. But I do know that lots of people are using it.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron. I learned a lot about the Brain Game Center as well as your research, and also about Endowed chairs. And I'm going to hand it over now to Emily.
Thank you very much. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Iqbal for serving as our interviewer today, and a special thanks to Professor Seitz for giving his time to educate us about his appointment as an endowed chair and his research. I would also like to thank all of you for attending and invite you to attend the next endowed chair interview on August 27th with Professor Jean Helweg, Anderson Chair in Finance from the School of Business. Thank you for your continued support of UCR. Have a wonderful evening.